Nagorno-Karabakh Republic is a de facto republic located in a very complex part of the world, as you can see on the map. It's also considered to be the heartland of both the nations of Azerbaijan and Armenia, and I must say it's a very, very beautiful region, but the purpose of these particular photos is not to document that beauty, so I hope you will forgive me if they are something less than a tourism advertisement. Instead, the photos show some of the physical residues of the conflict that began in the late 1980s and continued into the early 90s, involving Azerbaijan and Armenia with some Russian involvement as well. The underlying causes and issues have too many threads to them for me to be able to disentangle them in the short space available here, so I hope you'll again forgive me if I don't even embark on that particular journey. This is a Soviet war memorial. It's only really relevant to the extent that there was relative peace amongst the ethnic populations of Nagorno-Karabakh under the aegis of the Soviet Union. It's a complex question, of course, goes deeper than that, but there was relative peace until the disintegration of the Soviet Union, at which time the long simmering, one would say, tensions came to the surface and gave birth to what would prove to be a particularly messy war, in which the Armenian and Karabakhi forces eventually prevailed, resulting in the expulsion of all ethnic Azeris from the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. This is the so-called We Are Our Mountains monument. It's just outside the Nagorno-Karabakh capital of Stepanakert. It's intended to show the deep level of connectedness, I suppose, if there's such a word, between the Karabakhi people and their land. The Azeris, of course, have been uprooted, as mentioned a moment ago, so they do not fall within the ambit of this monument. This is a picture in Shushi, or Shusha, depending which language you speak. It's really rather ruined. It was a town that changed hands during the course of the conflict and was pummeled accordingly. Quite a distressing location because people are living in fairly dire circumstances, and well, you will see in subsequent images that it's really not an easy life there. This is the cathedral in Shusha. Despite appearances, it's actually relatively new, but there was obviously not a soul to be seen on the day that I was there. One expects that there's quite a lot of activity there from time to time, but just given the gloom of the day, and indeed the town as a whole, I have to say it did not really provide too much inspiration on this occasion, as you can probably see for yourself. This is not so far away from the cathedral. It was the central mosque in Shusha. At this point, of course, it stands completely deserted for lack of clients. So this is the interior of the mosque. As you can see, I mean, it hasn't really been defaced or destroyed, which lends credence to the theory that this dispute was really over territory and ethnicity, I suppose, but nothing to do with religion, because it's something of a phenomenon of this conflict that all the residual religious structures of the Azeris are actually fully intact. This is a view out of what was the former market hall in Shusha. Since basically destroyed, there's certainly no ceiling and or roof, and certainly no sign of food or any kind of commercial activity. It's just a ruined structure standing there. This person passing by, I guess, is quite typical of the people that you see. Many of them were also carrying plastic buckets and so forth to transport water, because I think the infrastructure there is essentially non-existent, unfortunately. This is another photo of, well, the person who was in fact my driver there, moving through the mist that was swirling around the ruins of Shusha. I suppose it just gives you a sense of how atmospheric it is. I mean, unfortunately, these places, depressing as they are, they certainly do not lack for atmosphere and photographic potential, but unfortunately I think the overriding sentiment has to be the really rather distressing setting of the entire thing. This is just a snapshot really, but it's significant because it is or was the first tank apparently to breach Shusha's defences. As I say, it was originally in the hands of the Azeris and strategically very important because it held the upper ground. So breaching the defences of that town and eventually conquering it was a very important moment in the war, and so that tank is actually festooned with flowers, but you can't really see them, of course, because of the black and white image. Here we're driving along a Karabakhi country road in a trusty Lada, as you can see, which leads to a former Azeri town which was utterly destroyed by the Armenian forces during the course of the war, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that during the images to follow. This is an Azeri cemetery on the outskirts of the town in question. You can't get any closer than that because it is mined. There were quite a few signs along the road from Halo indicating where the minefields had been cleared, but the cemetery remained filled with mines apparently, so yes, it's certainly an image to ponder, I think, because one does wonder about the thought processes that go into placing mines in a cemetery to begin with. Right, we're now actually in the town. In the distance there you can see another former mosque, which is essentially perfectly preserved again, but we were unable to go any closer to it than that point, because this town is actually part of the front line, so the Azeri and Armenian forces actually face off against each other here, so there were just limits in terms of how far we could go on this occasion. I think this photo gives you quite a good idea of the level of destruction in this town. Apparently the Karabakh and Armenian forces went through systematically blowing up the place street by street once they had taken control of it, so that the Azeris, even if they were to return, would find nothing there. And I would say that they succeeded in this on a very impressive scale. I've never seen destruction really to rival anything quite like it. This is a typical streetscape in the city. Again, you can see the scale of the destruction. The place was indeed essentially deserted except for occasional Armenian patrols who gave me fairly dirty looks and weren't really thrilled to see me there, but I think they were somehow tolerant on this day. That's the reason I'm not mentioning the name of the town. If you research it, I'm sure you'll find out easily enough, but I'm not going to be the one who recommended that you should go there, because there are certainly risks involved. This one can only assume was a Soviet-style parade ground, so at one point lots of hustle and bustle and plenty of life, but now only a few scrap metal seekers and Armenian patrols. It's an ugly spot, unlike the rest of the town in its former incarnation, one thinks, because it must be said that the architecture of the residential buildings would have been very attractive. Many sandstone buildings, finely carved, but there are only traces of that left over due to the scale of the destruction. Again, in the same town, you can only wonder how that piece of motor vehicle ended up there. I would add that this is not indicative of the whole of Nagorno-Karabakh. This is just one particularly depressing aspect of it. Places like Stepanakert, they have life to them. The people are absolutely delightful, but that's just not the purpose of these particular images. I'm showing the grimmer side, but I did have some very enjoyable times there as well. Please don't misunderstand. And one last look at the mosque brings us to an end of our brief visit to Nagorno-Karabakh. I hope you have found this at least slightly interesting and illuminating, or maybe illuminating is a better word given the lighting conditions in many of these pictures. If you are interested, I would certainly recommend a visit to Karabakh itself, where you will be warmly received by the locals. And that said, I would also recommend a visit to Azerbaijan. As I say, the complexities of this conflict make it essential, really, to hear both sides of the tale from the locals themselves, who can explain it far better than I. And if you're really interested in these kinds of images and topics, I would also warmly welcome you to my website, since this is my field of specialization, and so there's plenty more similar material to be found there. Alright, thank you very much, and bye bye.